Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at some of the internal and external constraints or influences impacting consumer choice, starting with the external factors. So we assume that the traditional consumer relies on the assumption that people are fully rational and make purely rational decisions. They can rank their preferences and make fully informed choices. However, in real life there's a whole range of other factors that influence consumers' decision, and we're going to be looking at the importance of these factors and how they challenge the traditional assumptions of our behaviour. So in terms of external influences, in this video we're going to look at culture, marketing and advertising, government laws, and then you need to also be aware that family and friends and ethnicity can also impact the choices that we make. We'll look at internal influences in the next video. So external influence, the first one is culture. When you're defining culture, it's the body of values, beliefs and attitudes that members of society share. So it can be your own values based on religion, based on personal preference, or your own beliefs. It can also be attitudes that are formed around society. They're shaped mainly by people's environment that they live in, their religion and history, and are passed on from generation to generation. So some through religious practices, education, etc., etc. So culture has a powerful influence over consumer choice. So for example, now it's smoking is seen as to be more harmful to your health, and therefore that's led due to high levels of education. There's this sort of negative perception around smoking now because of the fact that it can have harmful impacts on your health. Not eating meat on Good Friday is another example of how culture shapes our thinking. So people choose not to eat meat on Good Friday even if they're not Catholic because of the sort of perception amongst society. Other influences, marketing. So marketing is referred to all activities trying to attract consumers to a business's products. So it includes advertising, but it can also include like branding, putting up billboards, all that kind of stuff related to try and promote your product. The idea of marketing is to establish brand loyalty. So they try and create an impression in the minds of consumers that their product has no viable substitute, so that they will buy that product and are less responsive to changes in price. So the idea is to make a more inelastic demand for a product, so they can raise their prices, and that will only cause a small decrease in demand, and therefore they can maximize their profits. So Apple, for example, because they have high levels of brand loyalty, they're able to have an inelastic demand for their product, and that allows them to increase their prices without having too much of a negative impact on demand. Framing is another key thing. Framing questions in a positive way is key to effective advertising. So good examples of framing is Milo. They always show kids actively eating outside. Nutri-Grain with the Iron Man food. And then a whole range of other products are branded, framed in a certain way, whether that's makeup, clothes, etc., etc. So behavioural economists argue that the way consumers react to situations or propositions are heavily dependent on the way they are framed, or the context in which they are presented. They gave you that example in class about government giving a stimulus package as opposed to a rebate. When they framed it as a stimulus package, more and more people were willing to spend the money, whereas a rebate they thought that it was getting back what they lost. So in terms of arguments for and against advertising, people that are against advertising argue that it manipulates consumer preferences and gets them to buy things that they don't need. Rather than consumers determining what is produced in the economy, businesses control what is produced and then convince consumers what to buy. This can lead to materialism, conspicuous consumption, where people buy things when they don't need to. Conspicuous consumption is about buying things to signal your wealth or your status in society. So it puts extra pressure on our resources and can lead to increased inequalities. Whereas those for advertising argue that it conveys important information about products, whether that's on the price, quality, etc., etc., and enables consumers to make better comparisons of products and more informed, rational decisions. So there are arguments for and against advertising, depending on whether you view it as being materialistic and convincing people to buy products they don't need, or providing more information about the quality of products. So one of the features of advertising is to create a more inelastic demand for products. So if you look at this curve, at a price of $150, there's a demand for 600 units. When we increase that price to 200, that decreases the demand to 100 units. So that has a highly elastic demand because the $50 change in price has led to a massive decrease in demand. Okay, so you lose all that revenue from not selling those last 150 units. Sorry, last 500 units. When it has an inelastic demand curve, you raise the price by a lot and it only has a small impact on the quantity demanded. So demand only goes down by 20 units, even though the price is 5 times as high. and therefore you gain all this revenue when you raise your price, the orange section, and only lose the little blue section in there. We'll talk about PED more in class. I won't go into that now. So if a curve has an elastic curve, it means that if it's above 1, it's considered elastic, and that means a 10% increase in price would lead to a 30% fall in demand. So the quantity is 3 times as responsive as the price. If quantity moves by a greater margin than price, then it's classified as an elastic good. If quantity goes down by a smaller margin than the price changes or goes up, then it's considered to be an inelastic good. Okay, second thing, the government can have a big impact on the goods and services we buy. So the government can use their taxes to influence consumer spending. They can also pass new laws or prohibit consumption of certain goods and services, and that has a big impact on consumer spending as well. So, for example, the government can influence and create positive and negative incentives to ensure consumers purchase certain goods and services. So the government will look to promote goods with positive externalities. When you use the word positive externalities, they're benefits that accrue to third parties that are not part of the transaction. So it occurs when the consumption of a good or service confers a benefit on a third party or a bystander. This means that someone who did not pay for the good or service received part of the benefit from that good or service. So a good example would be when you get an education that has third-party benefits in the fact that in the future you're less likely to commit crimes, you're more likely to increase our economic growth, you're likely to generate tax for the government. If you vaccinate your children, that has third-party benefits because you're unlikely to get other children sick. Parents will be missing less work days because their children aren't getting sick as much. That can lead to increased productivity for businesses and increased production. It can also help to boost our economic growth. So the government will often subsidise or create laws to create consumption of goods with positive externalities. So, for example, there's positive externalities in people wearing bike helmets because that helps to reduce injuries and therefore less of a burden on our tax system. So the government creates a law that you have to wear a helmet. Or the government subsidises education to make it cheaper so that we can internalise those benefits of education. They might subsidise research and development into health or technology, because if they subsidise research and development into health, it makes it cheaper, and they might come up with a cure for some disease like heart disease or cancer, which confers benefits to third parties in the form of any patients or loved ones of patients. Discouraging consumption of goods with negative externalities. So when the consumption of a good or service imposes a cost on a third party, without government intervention, too many resources would be allocated to these goods and services because people don't factor in the harmful effects of their consumption. So many of the costs spill over onto third parties. So good examples of negative externalities in consumption with cigarettes might be passive smoking. It may be that you get sick and then taxpayers have to pay for your health treatment if you get liver cancer or something like that. It can also lead to more days lost for businesses, so more sick days, which can cost them money, cost the economy money. Alcohol can cause binge drinking, violence, etc., etc. Another massive negative externality in consumption is climate change. So when businesses burn fossil fuels and pollute, that has big impacts on the third parties in the form of rising sea levels, airborne diseases, and a whole range of other problems, natural disasters that can spill from climate change. There's just some examples of negative externalities. So alcohol, cigarettes, noisy parties all have costs on third parties, and these are positive externalities: research and development and vaccines. So, for example, with cigarettes, they're negative externalities because the consumption of cigarettes can result in negative externalities, as non-smokers can develop smoking-related illnesses from inhaling secondhand smoke. It can lead to pressure on the government to provide health services to sick patients who are suffering from lung cancer or emphysema. So the government creates negative incentives and puts a tax on producers, which raises the price of cigarettes and leads to less people smoking. Some of these taxes, unfortunately, are ineffective because of the inelastic demand. Other policies to reduce smoking: plain packaging laws, so you can't brand your products and they have to look with ugly symbols like these ones. Anti-smoking campaigns, laws prohibiting smoking in public places. These are all likely to shift the demand or reduce the demand for products, and therefore help to reduce the negative externality as well. Education examples of positive externalities: higher productivity for society, increased innovation, a more tolerant and harmonious society with less crime. Without government intervention, too few labour and capital resources would be allocated to education, because people wouldn't be willing to pay for their children to get an education if it was too expensive. Some people would pay if they had the money, but there would be not enough people would be able to afford an education. So the government steps in and they say we're going to mandate a minimum school leaving age, provides education free of charge through public schools, they subsidise private schools, and they provide HECS for university students, all aiming to try and internalise these positive externalities and create more resources towards education. Vaccinations, if you get a flu vaccination, society benefits too. If you decision not to get vaccinated, not only protects your children from getting the flu, but also others that haven't been vaccinated. So the government subsidise the cost of vaccinations to make them cheaper, so they give money to businesses to provide vaccinations. They have negative incentives like no jab, no pay, which means that if you don't vaccinate your children, you don't get access to childcare benefits, to try and encourage consumers to vaccinate their children. We'll talk about internal factors in the next video.